Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this TLC Symposium Series. I am Nikki Trombley. I am your host for today, and we have Dr. Jamie Arndt with us today, who will be talking about social psychology. Today's webinar is commercially sponsored by Worth Publishers. Dr. Arndt is an author of Social Psychology by Greenberg, Schmader, Arndt, and Landau, a publication of Worth Publishers. There are no known conflict or interests other than this commercial sponsorship. So welcome, Dr. Arndt. Before we get started into your presentation slides, I just want to give a few WebEx notes. For those of you that are not connected via phone to the WebEx, you cannot actually hear what I'm saying at this moment, but perhaps you can easily connect calling into this number where my cursor is. There is an audio button on the top of your WebEx bar up there. If you have any questions, you can please feel free to chat me. And going along with that, we will be having a question and answer session at the end of Dr. Arndt's presentation. But throughout the course of the presentation, feel free to use your chat feature. It's up there in your bar. And you can send a chat directly to me. I'm the host, Nikki Trombley, or you can send it to Jamie and myself using the host, presenter, and panelist feature. But feel free to chat those questions to me, and I will be able to read them out loud during the question and answer session. And just a little bit about Dr. Jamie Arndt. He is the 2012 Frederick A. Middlebush Professor of Psychological Sciences at the University of Missouri. After attending Skidmore College in the eastern United States for his BA and the University of Arizona in the West for his PhD, he settled in the middle of the country, accepting a position at MU in 1999. During his time at MU, he received the Robert S. Daniel Jr. Faculty Teaching Award, the Provost Junior Faculty Teaching Award, the International Society for Self and Identity Early Career Award, and the University of Missouri Chancellor's Award for Outstanding Research and Creative Activity in the Social and Behavioral Sciences. He is a founding member of the Social Personality and Health Network, former chair of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology Training Committee, and has served on the editorial board of various journals in the field. He has authored or co-authored scholarly works pertaining to the self, existential motivation, psychological defense, and their implications for many topics, most notably health decision-making, creativity, and legal judgment. So once again, please feel free to contact me via the chat feature if you have any questions during Dr. Arndt's presentation. And with that, I am going to pass the ball along to Dr. Arndt so that you can share your screen and we can get started.
All right, thanks, Nikki. And thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to have the chance to talk with you all about social psychology today. Let me note here at the outset that, ideally, I'd much rather this be a dialogue rather than a monologue. This, of course, is a little tough to do in the WebEx format. I'm going a lot on trusting Nikki in virtual face that there are people out there that you can hear me. But I'd love your feedback and suggestions. So if you have questions during the talk, feel free, as Nikki mentioned, to chat them to her, and we'll check in periodically, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for any suggestions or feedback, questions and comments that you all have at the end. So I'm going to assume that most of you all have taught social psychology or will teach social psychology, or at least entertaining the notion of teaching social psychology. And just to put in a plug for the topic, for my colleagues Jeff Greenberg, Tony Schmader, Mark Landau, and I, whether it's large or small enrollments, teaching social psychology is just a thrilling class to teach, largely because when you think about the things that we think about, the things that we experience, whether it's the everyday life, the everyday issues of our desires, our insecurities, our egotism, our prejudices, our efforts to make sense of the world and to grow and connect with each other. This is fundamentally what social psychology tries to explain. And communicating some level of insight to students is really something that we all find tremendously exciting. At the same time, there are some challenges here, and when I was first gearing up to teach the course many moons ago, and still true to this day, these thrills can be quickly tempered by the daunting realization that there are so many challenges associated with weaving together the myriad insights that social psychology has to offer, and weaving these insights together in a way that connects the material truly to the lives that students lead, weaving the material together in a way that makes it engaging and dynamic to the students, and perhaps most challenging of all, presents a coherent picture of the human condition. And one thing that sort of freaks me out continually is, okay, what happens if I don't meet these challenges? And the concern is that you're then going to place students in the role of, mindlessly being a passive recipient of some fragmented view of what's often portrayed as rather distinct forms of social behavior, nodding off potentially as we drone on about analyses of what seem to be sometimes almost entirely different creatures, right? You've got Conrad the conformer, another person prone to altruism, another to aggression, another to esteem enhancement. And so this is the concern, and these types of concerns are what led Jeff, Tony, Mark, and I to embark on a new textbook with the goal of presenting the best, the most relevant current findings from the field in a conceptually coherent and lively narrative. And so we've worked quite hard to dig deep into the literature, to stay abreast of the latest developments, and collaborate on every chapter, sometimes even on every paragraph or sentence, to produce a consistent voice that conveys our collective knowledge, experience, and insight. And what we've tried to emphasize are the core human motivations, cognitive processes, emotions, and cultural and situational forces that contribute to the varied ways in which people think, feel, and act. So what I'd like to do today is discuss 5 strategies that we use when teaching Intro to Social and that guided the development of our textbook. And to briefly preview what I'm going to cover, I'd like to talk about providing a broad foundation of perspectives, of using theories as the bridge between science and life, and further covering the cycle between theory, research, and the social world. Talk about removing barriers between basic and applied work, and finally, and very importantly, ways in which both in the text and in teaching we endeavor to boost student engagement. So again, just to remind, if you have questions during the talk, feel free to chat them to Nikki, and I'm happy to try to address them as we go. So the first strategy that I'd like to touch on is providing a broad foundation of perspectives. And to sort of get at this, I'd like you to take a moment to think about one of the more exciting experiences you've had in the last few months. Maybe it's publishing a paper, a family occasion from a recent holiday, or depressingly perhaps even sitting here for this webinar. But get a picture of the experience of it in your head, and then let's entertain a few questions. The first of which is to consider, how does this experience reflect something that would ultimately either enhance your survival and or having kids? How might people from a tribe, say, in the Amazon rainforest experience this event, if at all? How might your memory of this experience be influenced by other things that are currently going on in your life? How were different brain processes involved with the experience that you're conjuring up? And how does that experience give your life a sense of purpose? And what I'd like to suggest is that these kinds of questions can be very useful for us to consider. And in fact, we might want to tailor them to an in-class exercise. So I reproduce here for your convenience, if desired, how this could be pitched to students, same thing that we just went over. And I think this kind of exercise can be pretty helpful. On the substance side of things, it introduces students to 5 broad perspectives that have shaped the field. And these are perspectives that we try to acquaint our students with very early on in our text. And we do so because we think they help students to overcome a fragmented view of people and instead construct a coherent, more integrative conception of both other people and themselves, right? So these questions allow us to consider ourselves from an evolutionary perspective as organisms who are the product of and continue to exist in an evolutionary context. The questions allow us to consider ourselves and others from a cultural perspective, as cultural beings profoundly shaped by the social and environmental, what's this? Is requesting to annotate the share. I don't know what that means. I'm getting some message on my screen about an annotation request. So I'm going to decline. Nikki, let me know if that's something I should accept.
I'm not familiar what the annotation request may be, so feel free to decline that.
Okay. Yeah, so we can consider the cultural perspective, right, that we are beings profoundly shaped by the social, by the environmental context in which we live. We can also consider, we can also consider ourselves from the social cognitive perspective as negotiating a constant flux of information, bringing our prior knowledge to bear on our current experiences, as well as our memories to bear on our prior experiences to bear on our current experience as well. We can also consider ourselves from a neuroscientific perspective as biological entities in which these processes take place in the brain and its interrelation with the rest of the body. And finally, we can consider ourselves from an existential perspective as actors driven and motivated to see our lives as making sense and having value. And by introducing first off and then revisiting these perspectives throughout the book and also when we teach, we help to build an integrated conception of people that further provides schemas to facilitate the students' understanding and memory of later specific information that we'll expose them to. So we're helping to give them a shelving system, if you will, into which they can store the knowledge that we're trying to impart. And in so doing, what we're trying to do here, too, is capitalize on the self-reference effect, fostering the sense that they themselves, they are the very focus of the course. They are the focus of the text. They are the focus of social psychology. And by doing so, we're hopefully improving encoding and comprehension and imparting the sense that to the extent that social psychology is about their life, if they care about their lives, this may be a course that they want to invest in. One thing I'll note is that we don't present any of these 5 broad perspectives in a rigid or imperialistic way. We don't organize any chapter around one perspective in a formulaic manner. Rather, we try to provide enough continuity and perspectives across the text to give students a more coherent, comprehensible, and memorable discussion of the best and most useful theories that are relevant to the topic at hand. All right, so the second strategy that I'd like us to consider endeavors to use theories as the bridge between science and life. And one of the coolest things I think about social psychology is that when you think about it, we are just awfully clever when it comes to methodology. And the studies that feature such clever approaches are just so much fun to explain to people. A couple of my favorites, just to illustrate, Tom Gilovich a number of years ago and colleagues had a student wear a T-shirt with a picture of Barry Manilow on it. And the job of the students was to estimate how many other people they think would notice the less than desirable, from their perspective, decoration on their shirt. And they did this as a way to study egocentric biases and what they call the spotlight effect. A few years prior, Neil McCrae did some tremendous studies in which he had students, upon coming into the lab, being told to pull up a chair next to the other person. I know the other person's not there yet, but there's their gear on the chair. There's a backpack and a jacket that had skinhead type apparel on it. And the idea of the study was to measure how far the subject set up their chair from the presumed confederate, the presumed other person, as a way to measure distancing from stereotypes. And I love this study. Largely because I love the use of confederates in research, and to the extent that they enhance experimental realism. But of course, using confederates is kind of a pain because you've now got to schedule your experimenter, your participants, and oh yeah, a third party, the confederate. So I thought Neil very ingeniously used a confederate without actually having a confederate. And it's a very cool approach. And these are tremendously fun studies to go over. I think we have to be that clever in a way to study the amorphous, sensitive processes like prejudice and egotism that we do, but there are potential pitfalls here as well. And I think one of the chief ones is that as we get enamored with our methodological creativity, we run the risk of social psychology becoming about measures and manipulations rather than phenomena. We risk social psychology becoming about studies and not life. It can become an encyclopedia of often clever but ultimately trivial findings too far removed from the conceptual ideas that enable students to truly understand not just what people do, but why they do it. So one of our second strategies is to endeavor to avoid this pitfall, and we do so by capitalizing on the power of theory. And we sort of take a three-pronged attack in this vein. First off, we take the time to explain truly what theories are and what they do. We emphasize that theories are the vehicle through which we explain and understand our social world. And then we take the time to lay out specific theories in the field, ones that often have implications for understanding diverse social phenomena. For example, we cover at length theories like attachment, cognitive dissonance, self-evaluation maintenance, system justification, self-determination, self-perception, reactance, the ELM, and many, many more, with the idea of really giving people the tools to appreciate the conceptual ideas underlying these theoretical conceptions. And then finally, we try to guide students to integrate the theories with the empirical work, to go beyond the encyclopedic flashcard learning and give students a richer, more deep store of ideas that they can use to understand the phenomena at hand. And if you like this kind of an approach and kind of emphasis, I think there are ways to complement it with a number of different types of in-class exercises, many of which inspired by Bill McGuire and his approach, in which we can try to help students appreciate the integrative and generative power of theory. One exercise that I like to try every now and again is to give students 3 research findings from a particular theory, not couching them as coming from a theory, but just give them the nuts and bolts of a couple of different findings. So what I show here is obviously textual overkill for a PowerPoint slide. It's far too dense. In fact, it's the poster child for what I tell my students not to do when they're giving talks. But I want to just give you a very brief flavor of how this kind of thing can look. So what I illustrate here are 3 findings from the dissonance literature you may recognize, one being Aronson and Mill's work on effort justification, another being Jack Brem's early work on spreading the alternatives and reactance, and Stone and colleagues' work on hypocrisy and motives for self-integrity, the idea is just to provide the nuts and bolts of a given study. So we can note Jack Brem's work on spreading of alternatives, wherein participants rate either a very difficult decision between appliances very similar in quality or a very dissimilar set of appliances, an easier decision, later rate the appeal of the appliances, finding that those who made a choice between similar approaches became more positive in their ratings of the chosen appliance and more negative towards the rejected. All right, so the idea, again, is just the nuts and bolts of the findings, and then to hit people with a few questions. To ask them, first off, what do they recall from what they just read? How much do they remember? But then also, and I think potentially more provocatively, ask them how interesting they found these particular studies, and to what extent do they see the findings of these studies relating to their own life. And if your students are anything like the ones that I have, what we tend to see is a modicum of insight here, not a lot of depth, and mostly, well, to be frank, a bunch of BS. But if we then represent the findings, but this time preface them with a brief description of the theory from which they are derived, or you could set this up, I'm sure you're seeing, as a between subjects demo where some people get the findings, other people get the theory and findings. But the idea here is just to give them a brief snippet of the conceptual parent of this empirical work, noting, for example, the cognitive dissonance theory proposes people have a motive for consistency. When cognitions are inconsistent, people experience an unpleasant psychological tension that they're motivated to reduce, and so on, through a number of variety of alternatives. And the idea is to give them the theoretical lineage and then reassess your outcomes. That is, ask them what do they remember from the findings they read, how interesting and how relevant do they find the work. And I think this kind of exercise can facilitate a discussion of how theory makes sense of research findings and how it makes that research more meaningful. And students can see that having that theoretical background improves one's ability to recall the information that they've seen. So to the extent that a student is simply motivated by GPA, you can get the buy-in from the perspective of, hey, you're going to actually do better on your tests if you take the time to get this conceptual framework down. But then it also reveals to us that it makes research more interesting and also more relevant, both to them and the world in which they live. So with this exercise, the idea is to give students a greater appreciation for the power of theory. But I think there are other ways to go a step further and to try to foster a greater appreciation for the types of ideas and findings and research that you're going to be communicating to students. And that brings me to my third strategy, which entails covering the progressive cycle between theory, research, and the social world. And one way we try to do that is to continually highlight the interrelationship between these different elements, to try to help students grasp how life, theories, studies, and data can mutually inform each other in a progressive cycle of understanding. And I'm guessing that, early on in teaching the course, early on in the semester, within the first couple of classes, perhaps you have a lecture or a significant portion thereof focused on research methods. And certainly most textbooks do, but most also do so independent from theory testing, as if the research methods exist in a vacuum tightly sealed from the world they are presumably trying to explain. And in contrast to that, we aimed for a more integrative presentation of the research cycle. And there are two major facets of this presentation, the first of which is to be very explicit in considering the elements of the cycle. The first of which is, well, life. Right? We start with some aspect of life that we want to explain, some phenomena that catches our interest or that we think is important to understand, and we propose an explanation for that phenomenon. And this explanation can either be a formal or informal theoretical idea. And these theories, in turn, right, they generate hypotheses that we then test in research. And we go over the basic distinction between correlational and experimental methods, both of which then yield an outcome, which in turn we feed back to inform the viability of our theoretical conceptualization. So the theory that may be revised, altered, added to, or even replaced is then used to explain the element of life that we started out wanting to understand. We try to convey here that findings, outcomes are not ends in themselves, but means to an end, with that end being understanding, that end being explanation, or, in another word for it, theory. All right, so this is the foundation that we try to convey. I find when I teach it and go over it in lecture, it's a tenuous foundation for a house not yet built. And what I mean by that is students, when I'm talking in these abstract terms, often look at me like I've just chowed a bunch of peyote buttons and are having a difficult time tracking. So the second element of our presentation of our approach is to breathe life into this depiction by illustrating how it can work with a particular phenomenon. So what we do in the text is we start with the idea that, okay, we want to understand the important issue of disparities in minority performance. And so we then note from there a theory that we can use to give us some access point to this issue, stereotype threat theory. And from here we go over a couple of hypotheses that the theory generates. For example, that the more conscious a person is of a negative stereotype of their group, the worse they will perform in stereotype areas. And then we introduce the basics of research design by describing studies that test these hypotheses. So, for example, we illustrate correlational designs by describing evidence of a negative relationship between stigma consciousness and GPA. We then introduce experimental design by describing studies such as Claude Steele and Josh Aronson's classic test of the causal effect of activating group-based stereotypes on intellectual performance. And then we go further to talk about the pros and cons of different designs, issues of validity, ethics in research, and so forth. And I think by helping students to grasp the full cycle, our text enables you as an instructor to focus students on the portions of the cycle that help you meet specific teaching goals. So let me note 4 such goals and how they can be further driven home by in-class or take-home types of assignments. So one of the things that we get here, of course, is we get the basics of the scientific method in a way that can help students to navigate not only social psychological findings, but the sea of scientific and often purportedly scientific information that they encounter in the course of their daily life, whether it be from the mass media, political candidates, and so on. So, for example, they get a better understanding, a better sense of how to think about causality and critically evaluate alternative explanations for correlations. And to drive this point home, one of the things that you might do is you could give them an exercise in which they're challenged to find a newspaper story that reports the results of either a correlational or experimental design, and ask them to identify what type of design is used and therefore what type of conclusion is warranted. Okay. Another thing that we can focus on is this connection between hypotheses and research. And what we're trying to do is provide the basis for encouraging students to generate their own hypotheses and imagine creative ways to test them. All right, and we think this is important, of course, because it lifts the students out of the typical role of being a passive recipient of knowledge and places them in the role of being an active investigator. Put another way, it allows students an opportunity to partake in the process of inquiry and not just consume its product. And to drive this point home, you might include an exercise in which you assign students a theory and have them derive a couple of predictions from that perspective. Right, in a similar vein, but different from extending theories, this kind of approach opens the door to having students come up with their own theories in an effort to explain aspects of social life, their social life, that had yet to be considered systematically. So again, we're trying to put students in the driver's seat, and we can drive this home by asking students, say, to generate a causal explanation for a recent experience, but then to generalize, to explain that experience in a way that generalizes beyond the specific instance, and illustrate to them that in so doing, what we're doing is we're building the platform for a theoretical explanation. And finally, I think what we're doing is we're conveying to students that you should and certainly are encouraged to bring your own gut-level intuition into the classroom, into the textbook, to think as we go over stuff, how does that fit with what I've experienced in my life? Does it help me make sense of what I've been exposed to? But also to realize that you need to balance that with a recognition that sometimes our common sense beliefs are misplaced. Sometimes they're not correct, so we need to use a blend between our intuition and checking that intuition against the observable world through research. So here, one exercise we might do is have students early on in the semester write about an intuition they have, and then later in the semester, because it's always fun to go back and check out stuff that you did a while prior, have them come up with a study that either supports or refutes that intuition. All right. As social psychologists talking about theory, it seems like we're required to dust off some old Kurt Lewin. I think it's in the rule book, and this is relevant in particular to our discussion between potential barriers between basic and applied work and how we might endeavor to remove those kinds of barriers. So at one point or another, I'm guessing many of you might include a nod to Lewin's famous quote, "There is nothing so practical as a good theory." Certainly most textbooks do, but the question that we wondered when we were starting out thinking about how we're going to put together our text is, does our pedagogy really reflect this Lewinian idea? And if you think about a couple of contents from other textbooks, what do we see? We see that clinical and health psych and law psych, etc., they're segmented off to the back of the book, roomed together with the index and other such bench warmers, as though they are somehow separate from the main thrust of the course. And in fact, sometimes they're not even chapters, but they're modules. It's almost like some unruly child that we relegate to the naughty table. And so that's a message that I think we had some skepticism about. When you think about the message that sends, on the one hand, I think it's important to note that it does have a lot of merit, right? That the idea here is that students should understand the basic ideas before seeking to apply them. All right, so I want to certainly acknowledge that, but on the downside end of things, we worry it also fosters a perceived distinction between basic and applied science. And what's more, the fact is that, at least according to some publisher surveys, many instructors never even get to this content. So we thought it was important to incorporate applications with the main narrative, to make them an ongoing and explicit feature of students' learning. And surveys indicate that at least a considerable majority of social psych instructors prefer this solution over relegating applied content to more of an afterthought. And this can complement, one of the advantages we think is that this can complement the approach that one takes in lecturing. Right. So if we think about a few examples, many of you may cover or think about covering self-regulation and ideas pertaining to regulatory focus, promotion and prevention orientation, or prospect theory. And we think a nice way to help students grasp these ideas is in the context of gain and loss framed health communications. Right. So we might present students with these two messages and ask them, which of these appeals works for you? And why might it work for you? How does it differ from the other? And this can be an engaging way to bring people into both the conceptual and applied idea. As another example, you might be gearing up to talk about Dan Wagner's ironic process theory or Jack Brem's reactance theory. And so we might ask students to recall an episode of the latest courtroom drama that they've seen wherein a judge admonishes a witness to disregard or the jury rather, to disregard a witness's inflammatory remark. And so we might ask students, do you think such admonitions are effective? Why or why not? Let's consider these theories for some answers to that question. So we think this sort of approach of integrating application both throughout lecturing but also throughout the text offers a lot of benefits for students. It encourages them to see the intimate interplay between theory, research, and application. It encourages them to see how the field's discoveries have perhaps their greatest value when applied to everyday experiences, important social issues, and contemporary events. And finally, this is sort of a big thing for me personally, it helps to establish an orientation to inquiry for the next generation of social psychologists, because of course there are a few out there in your class who may go on and make a career of this sort of thing. All right, so the final strategy that I'd like to touch on are ways, both in the text and in teaching, we can try to boost student engagement. Because the reality is, of course, an obvious one at that, is that for any of the strategies I've mentioned, or for any strategy for that matter, to be effective, students must be engaged. They must be engaged in reading, in classroom activities, and so the fifth strategy here is an approach of trying to connect content to the stimuli, ideas, and events that make up students' social world. And of course, there's just a ton of different ways to do this. For me, I've always been a fan of using music, movies, and TV clips to both engage students, entertain them at times, and most fundamentally, show how social psychology is centrally about the world that they experience. So what I'd like to go over are both some in-class strategies that we might use, as well as some in-text strategies that we might use, or that we do use. All right, so one of my favorites is to introduce topics with music. Okay, and the idea here is, right, you've got those 5 or 10 minutes when you come in, maybe you come in a little bit early, students are filing in, and there's just that silent time, you're setting up and so forth. And I think this is a great time to have some tunes playing in the background that you can then use to introduce the topic of the day or bring up later in the lecture. So this can also be a way to get students warmed up to talking. It's not that they don't talk, right? It's that they don't talk productively. So it's a way to get them warmed up to talking at least quasi-productively. So when I do this, I most often will start with asking them if they know or recognize what tune is playing, given that I tend to be, at least in their world, somewhat dated with my taste. They get to make fun of how out of touch I am with the contemporary music scene. But we can also ask them, what does the tune have to do with the topic of the day? And sometimes you can make a very explicit connection, and this is cool because they can see it very quickly. So, for example, if I'm teaching about self-regulation, in particular self-regulatory perseveration, I might play the Rolling Stones classic, You Can't Always Get What You Want. If I'm going to talk about reducing prejudice, I love to use the Black Eyed Peas song, One Tribe, which is basically a testimony to the video's common humanity ideas. If we're talking about relationship dissolution, it's always nice to turn to the Clash and their classic, Should I Stay or Should I Go? But sometimes the relevance is more obscure, and I often actually find this even more fun as the students try to hunt for the thread that connects the song and the topic. So, for example, if I'm talking about meaning and schemas and how schemas help us make sense of the world, it can be fun to play a song from the Talking Heads album Stop Making Sense, and a sort of ironic twist on the lack of understanding. In talking about persuasion, where you're obviously going to be touching on the bombardment of persuasive messages via television, playing Gil Scott-Heron's The Revolution Will Not Be Televised can be a good way to go. And so I think there's a variety of, obviously, an endless array of options out there for music to draw from. I think it's important if you like the tune that you're playing, because it gets you sort of pumped up to teach. At least that's the case for me. We're big fans of music, and we try to bring that into the text where it's engaging, where we find it might be engaging and appropriate. So, for example, when we're introducing groups in our chapter on groups, we do so by first talking about the Grateful Dead and Deadheads as an interesting way to consider questions about what makes a group and what makes a group not a group. And so I think bringing that sort of illustrations into the mix can be an engaging way to foster students' intention to the course. Another in-class strategy that we like to use is to use a lot of TV and movie clips to illustrate ideas. Remarkable as it may seem, students, they seem to get a little tired of hearing me drone on and on day after day. So a great way to break up the monotony is to use video. And certainly I don't mean in any way, shape, or form to imply that we're not into educational videos. Certainly we all like Milgram's Obedience Studies, the Jane Elliott Brown Eye, Blue Eyes demonstration of prejudice, and these are fantastic. Worth has done a tremendous job putting together an extensive video and digital activity library that draws from a number of news sources and so forth, and these are tremendously valuable, and I'd like to encourage you to check them out. But what I'd like to highlight, because perhaps it's often less well utilized, is that TV shows and movies also can be brought to the table, and they bring in some ways something more. They bring maybe a more immediate relevance to the lives that students lead in terms of what they see and watch, and perhaps some of the experiences that they find themselves having. So what I show here are just a few different clips that I like to use. These are all available, actually, and most of them are available on YouTube, although sometimes you got to do a bit of editing. I've done some work and talked about terror management in other contexts before, so I have sort of an army of clips if I want from that. The other source that I like to use is episodes from Seinfeld, or scenes from Seinfeld. For those of you who know the show, which is somewhat depressingly becoming somewhat dated at this point, at least in terms of students' familiarity with it, if you've ever got a topic where you're hinting at something pertaining to self-deception, self-presentational foibles, and so on, George Costanza can be counted on to illustrate it quite well. I was hoping to show a clip, but it's not going to work out via this format, but as one specific example, when you're dealing with or entertaining ideas about self-concept complexity or audience segregation or multiple audience dilemmas in terms of self-presentation, for those of you who know the episode, there's a wonderful sequence of scenes in which George explains the worlds collide theory. Much to his dismay, Jerry was not familiar with this theory in recommending that one of his friends, Elaine, asked George's then-girlfriend at the time to do something together, and it unleashes a typical George sequence of events. Another example is if you're introducing cognitive dissonance. Just a few years ago, Jon Stewart did a tremendous rap about dissonance in the context of political campaigning, which I think I encourage you to Google it. It's easy to find, and it's a lot of fun and spot on in terms of the theory. All right. Now, in the text, we also refer quite a bit to elements from news stories, news portrayals, popular and historical incidents, and we try, where appropriate and illustrated, to also use scenes from TV shows to illustrate ideas. One example that I note here when discussing social exchange and equity perspectives in terms of relationship issues, we draw from a scene from the sitcom Modern Family as a way of trying to illustrate these ideas. ideas. So I think there's, in short, just a number of ways we can bring in different types of elements. Now, sometimes these involve rather surface, quick-hitter kinds of illustrations. Oftentimes, we want to go deeper. We want to encourage a deeper consideration of core ideas. So in our text, what we have is a feature called Social Psych at the Movies. And here we show, and for every chapter, how the ideas and findings covered in the main narrative are reflected in a particular classic or contemporary film. So I show here an example where we discuss how Sean Penn's character in Milk exemplifies the influence of charismatic leaders on groups. Here's another example that tracks changes in media depictions of gender stereotypes across the decade. Another strategy that we use throughout the text is a feature that we call Social Psych out in the real world. And the idea here is to connect the ideas that we're exploring to health, law, politics, social justice, fashion, a variety of very central topics that perhaps are not always the direct consideration of traditional social psychological texts. Food, for example, is one that's obviously very important to most of our lives, mine to be sure. And so we talk about the relationship between culture and food. Here's another example that discusses magical thinking and attribution in the context of common superstitious beliefs. So these are just a few examples of ways in which we try to capitalize on strategies that facilitate student engagement, to break up the monotony of course lectures, and certainly this doesn't apply to our text, right, because the reading is not monotonous, of course, but were it to be so, this would help to break it up. It helps to illustrate social psychological ideas in action. It draws students in as active participants in the learning process, and enable students, I think, help students to start to look at the world through a social psychological lens. And then from a teaching perspective, if you use these kind of clips and music and so forth, one of sort of the tangential benefits is that if students get into it, they start recommending often more contemporary stuff, so you can incorporate that as well and not seem, like myself, so dated in the stuff that you use. So just to wrap up, because I see we're getting close on time and I want to leave time for questions, mention 5 different strategies for conveying what we really construe as the science of everyday life. And I hope that I've at least piqued your interest in checking out some of what we've offered. We'd love to hear your comments and questions that you have. If you cannot stick around for the chat session or are unable to ask your question, you should feel free to email any one of us. We're happy to dialogue with you about what we tried to accomplish in the book or how we could do so better and so forth. So let me close just by thanking you very much for your attention today. And let me turn it over to you, Nikki.
Yeah, wonderful. That was great, and thank you very much for sharing all of that presentation with us. I am now going to share my desktop one more time and let everyone know we're going to open this up for question and answers right now. But while you are chatting me your questions to read out loud to the group, feel free to also write down this CE credit survey code here. I will be sending an email out to all of you with Dr. Arndt's slides, a survey that you will need this code for your CE credits, as well as a link for the WebEx recording from today. But I see that some chats are coming in. Also, if you want to, you can raise your hand on the participants bar. There's a little hand icon that you can click, and it will raise your hand, and it will notify me, and I can unmute your line so that you can ask Dr. Arndt your question directly. But right now, we have a question from Matthew for Dr. Arndt. Have you ever found that student demographics impact classroom discussions and engagement with certain topics, example, prejudice, race bias themes, et cetera?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think they certainly can. You know, for better or worse, I've tended to teach rather large sections of Intro to Social, so 100, 200, 300 people. And while I really endeavor to foster a more participatory, discussion-oriented approach, even with that size class, it's obviously limited when you have that many people. But I think particularly when you have smaller sections, the demographics of your course can play a huge role, and that can work both for you and against you. So to the extent that you can encourage people, if you have diverse demographics and can encourage people to share their perspectives and experiences, I think that's an awesome thing to try to do. I found when you get, as soon as you get below 100, it's easier to get more discussion going. And then you are so much at the whims of those particular people who seem to be talkers. And sometimes those people are great and they stimulate discussion in a really productive fashion. And then sometimes those people, you don't want to show it, right? But you're just sort of cringing when you're like, are you really going to take us there? And so the demographics and the sensitivity, perhaps, with which you present the topics like prejudice in particular, that's one that sticks out. We also write in our text, and I lecture when I teach about aggression against women, and that's, I think, another sensitive, tricky one. I think it is important to be mindful of the demographics and to make sure that you are presenting things in appropriate, acceptable, and engaging fashion for all.
Great, wonderful. We had a lot of positive comments, and thanking you for your presentation. Just to let everyone know, I will be sending Dr. Arndt's slides out. So there are a few of you that were really interested in the list of songs that he cited within his slides. You will have access to that. You could certainly copy and paste it and print it out if you'd like to. But that will be coming via follow-up email from me.
Yeah, if people come up with other great ideas for tunes, feel free to send them my way. It's always fun to have a good pool of stuff to draw from.
Absolutely. Any other questions? I have a lot of comments coming through, and I can certainly pass those along to Dr. Arndt as well with praises. Any other questions? Anyone want to raise their hand and ask live questions as well? We'll leave the line open a little longer, just in case there are some lingering questions that are taking some time to type out. Oh, here's another one. Any particular theories or examples you would suggest, Dr. Arndt?
Any particular theories or examples in what?
In regards to a theme of social justice.
Oh, a theme of social justice. That is interesting. In terms of media that one can use to draw from that, there's certainly no shortage of both contemporary news events when you get into a lot of the police shootings that have dominated attention over the last year or so. There's certainly no shortage of television shows and clips if you want to try to draw from those. It seems like every time one turns on the TV, there's another episode of Law and Order on some channel. So I think there's a lot of media that one can use for social justice in a lot of ways to connect those ideas to popular, or not to say popular, but events that are dominating the contemporary news scene. And then in terms of the ideas that one is presenting and how to connect them, I think one of the things that social psychologists don't always do a great job of, certainly some do, but we don't always do a great job of, is taking even our very basic theories and applying them to pertinent, timely social issues. And so I think just about any motivational theory, for example, and I tend to like those, I have a personal penchant for those, could be applied to understanding reactions to social justice. And that can be a great exercise to present students with, to present them with a particular theory, whether it be dissonance theory or social identity theory, or any number of perspectives, and to have students develop the application to a particular event that perhaps dominated the news of late. How would social identity theory explain reactions to the Ferguson decision, and so forth? So I think those could be some really exciting ways to go.
Wonderful. And one more comment about the social justice theme. This particular attendee just thought of All in the Family, and she's asking if she could get those scenes from All in the Family.
You know, what I'm just amazed at, and I'm the last person in the world who's very good at this. I fortunately have a student who's very, very good at this, but is YouTube. You can find anything. It's just remarkable on YouTube. So obviously, you know, for the textbook, we can't, or the resources that we provide, we can't license scenes from sitcoms and that sort of stuff, or at least we lack the considerable money that it would cost to do so. But you can go to YouTube, and people have edited these things. There's software you can get to edit these things as well. And so I think All in the Family is a tremendous one. I'm surprised I never thought of that. I think that's a great idea.
Wonderful. All right, any last questions from the crowd? All right, I'm going to stay on the line for another 5 minutes. If you do have any questions, just keep chatting to me. Otherwise, you will be receiving a follow-up email from me. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Dr. Arndt.
Oh, thank you all very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Hey, Jackie, if you are still on the line, it looks like you may have a question. There is a question mark next to your name. I'd be happy to unmute you if you want to ask Dr. Arndt your question.
Sure, that would be great. I just completely forgot about it. I just thought of it because I work for Grand Canyon University, and we have traditional and we have online formats, and online is becoming more and more, as you know, with a lot of schools, it's becoming more and more predominant. And so I was just wondering if there were any challenges that he's faced, if he's taught online before with this particular class, and if so, what his biggest challenge was.
Yeah, no, thanks. I have not taught online before. In fact, this is the second time I've ever done an online virtual webinar thing.
Oh, okay. Cool.
So I am not a great person on that front to ask. But I think, I think that's clearly the way, as you know, things are headed and will increasingly head. And
right.
I think in some ways it really constricts what you can do, and in other ways it really enhances the potential of what you can do, right? So I guess for me, would be a challenge of figuring out how to compensate for the ways that it constricts and how to take advantage of the ways that it potentially enhances in terms of your ability to link to online content in the context of teaching and integrate that with your lecture. I could see that as having a lot of great potential.
Right, exactly. And, you mentioned, all the different examples of ways that you can be able to take what's happening in our world socially today and being able to connect that with the world of psychology. And that's really amazing that you can grab from the real world and be able to do that. So I imagine in an online environment you can still do that. It would just be a little, the instructor would just have to be able to keep the discussions going and make sure that they don't get like way off base, way out of control. And our instructors are really good at doing that for the most part from what I've heard. So I think it's just a matter of being able to control that.
Yeah, I think that would be more challenging where you have the relative anonymity and the lack of maybe social norms to inhibit people from expressing things that might not go over well with others. So I can see that as an interesting challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been to school online, and so I can see the challenge of you read what somebody says, and you can take it out of context, or you can read it as one way, and the person may have meant it another, and you don't have that way of seeing them face to face and reading their body language and seeing their expression, and so you have to kind of take it for what it's worth. So that can be difficult to, especially when you get into a sensitive subject like you mentioned, the Ferguson trial, and also even just recently the trial with the Boston bomber and what's going to happen with that, because he was found guilty, but then he's not, it's just really challenging because it's like, well, now he's going to face the death penalty, but how long will he be in the system? And so there's so much back and forth, and it's caused so much disagreement between people, and so those can be sensitive subjects, and to do that online, I think can pose some challenges.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a daunting element of things for sure.
Right, exactly. Well, great. I just wanted to kind of get a feel for that, if you had just taught traditional or if you had a chance to teach online with this class.
Yeah, just traditional so far, but I'm sure it's coming down the pike at some point.
Right, exactly. And with our undergraduate programs in psychology, we actually just have a general psychology and industrial organizational psychology right now, but we're expanding our reach of emphases. So we're going to have one in health psychology and geriatric psychology, criminal justice. So we're really like expanding into different areas. So it's going to be really interesting to see, because social psychology will be part of that core of courses. So all students, no matter what emphasis they go into, will get this course, the social psychology that we have. But we're going through a major revision right now with the whole entire bachelor's program to get up to date with APA standards and to make sure that because some of the